They said it was just a small violation, a harmless wooden box in my front yard, filled with books for kids and neighbors. But within days, I had warning letters, threats of fines, and an HOA board acting like I'd built a nightclub on my lawn. They ordered me to tear down my little free library or face legal action. Neighbors whispered. Some were scared to even take a book. But what the HOA didn't know was that their petty crusade was about to backfire so spectacularly that the entire town would get involved, and my violation would end up protected forever. How does a simple box of books go from threatened removal to official town landmark? I live in one of those neighborhoods that looks perfect from the outside. The grass is always trimmed to the same height, the mailboxes all match, and the driveways are pressure washed so often you can almost smell the bleach when you walk your dog. On the surface, it's quiet, clean, and desirable. The kind of place real estate agents brag about as well-maintained and highly regulated. When I first moved in, I thought that was a good thing. It was just me and my daughter, starting over after a rough divorce. I was a single dad trying to give her something steady. I wanted safe streets for her to ride her bike on, friendly neighbors to wave at, and a place where people still talked over fences and borrowed cups of sugar. The HOA fee felt like the price of stability, a small monthly payment in exchange for order and peace. At first, it almost felt like the brochure version of suburbia. Kids played on the cul-de-sac. People put up tasteful seasonal wreaths. There were community yard sales, block parties, and an email newsletter about lost pets and bake sales. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's cars and paused to chat at the mailbox. But underneath that politeness, there was something else. Something I didn't notice right away. You start to see it in small flashes. A neighbor getting a warning letter because their trash can was visible from the street for a few extra hours. Another being told to remove a flower pot because it was the wrong color. A Christmas display quietly taken down after a friendly reminder from the board. Nobody ever made a big scene about it. People just sighed, grumbled in private, and complied. The HOA president, a woman named Marlene, seemed to be everywhere. She always had a clipboard, always just checking in, always adding, "We have to keep the neighborhood standards up, you know." She smiled when she said it, but her eyes told a different story. It wasn't just about standards. It was about control. Still, life was fine. I worked from home as a freelance editor. My daughter went to the local elementary school, and our street became our little world. Every morning, I'd sit on the front porch with my coffee and watch kids walk to the bus stop. I noticed how many of them didn't have anything in their hands. No book, no toy, no distraction. Just staring at their phones or kicking rocks for 10 minutes before the bus came. That stuck with me more than I expected. I grew up in a tiny town where the library was my escape. We didn't have much money, but we had shelves and shelves of stories. I'd bike there after school, curl up in a corner, and disappear into other worlds for hours. It was the one place that always felt safe. For my daughter, that kind of space was a 20-minute drive away, and we didn't always have the time or energy to go. One afternoon, while scrolling online, I stumbled across an article about little free libraries. Those small, weatherproof boxes people put in their yards where anyone can take a book or leave a book. No card, no late fees, no rules. Just trust. The idea hit me like a jolt. A tiny, free, 24/7 library right in our front yard. Something for the kids waiting at the bus stop. Something for the retirees who took slow walks in the evening. Something that made our house feel less like just another beige box and more like a little corner of community. It felt harmless. It felt wholesome. It felt right. So I started planning. I found a used cabinet on a resale site, sanded it down in the garage, and painted it a cheerful blue that matched the shutters on our house. My daughter helped me decorate the sides with little painted stars and our favorite book quotes. We added shelves, a glass door, and a small wooden sign. Take a book, leave a book, all are welcome. There was something deeply hopeful about it. For a few evenings in a row, we stayed up later than usual, sorting through piles of our own books and donations from a few close friends. Children's books, mysteries, cookbooks, old paperbacks from college. We arranged them neatly, almost reverently, like we were stocking something sacred. The day we installed it, the weather was perfect. Clear sky, soft breeze, the kind of afternoon where the neighborhood feels like a movie set. We anchored the post into the ground near the sidewalk, right where kids passed on their way to the bus stop and where walkers could easily see it. A couple of neighbors walked by, slowed down, and smiled. One woman said it was adorable. Another said, "What a lovely idea." It felt like we'd done something good. Small, but good. That first evening, we watched from the front window as a group of kids noticed it. They opened the glass door gently, peered inside like it was a treasure chest, and one of them pulled out a worn copy of a fantasy novel. He turned it over in his hands, looked at his friends, and they all started talking and pointing. Eventually, he tucked it under his arm and walked away, grinning. My daughter looked up at me, eyes shining. "It's working," she said. For a few days, the little free library was exactly what we hoped it would be. People stopped on their walks. Books disappeared and were replaced by new ones. Someone left a handwritten note squeezed between the pages of a novel. "Thank you for this. I've been wanting to read more, but the library is too far for me to walk to." Our front yard didn't just feel like ours anymore. It felt shared, in the best possible way. But in a neighborhood obsessed with uniformity and rules, anything that stands out, even a cheerful blue box full of books, isn't just different. It's a disturbance. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come as a complaint. It came as a silence that felt heavier than usual. Marlene, the HOA president, walked past our house one morning, slowed down at the edge of our yard, and just stared at the library for a long time. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just looked, lips pressed tight, pen tapping against her clipboard. Then she moved on. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she liked it. Maybe she was thinking of starting one of her own. Maybe I was imagining the coldness creeping into her expression. After all, who could possibly have a problem with free books for kids? In our neighborhood, I was about to find out. Because while we saw a box filled with stories and second chances, someone else saw something very different, a violation. And in a place where rules are treated like sacred scripture, that single word can turn a peaceful life into a battlefield. The letter showed up 3 days after Marlene's quiet stare. It was folded so perfectly it almost looked harmless, slipped into our mailbox like any other piece of junk mail. The envelope had the HOA logo at the top, that neat little tree and house icon that was supposed to represent community. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped anyway. Inside, the language was cold and precise. It referred to my little free library as a non-compliant structure. It cited sections and subsections of the covenants. It said it was unauthorized, not in harmony with community aesthetics, and a potential safety concern. It ordered me to remove the structure within 10 days or face fines of $50 per day, plus legal fees if enforcement became necessary. $50 a day for a wooden box of books. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. I read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to figure out what exactly I had done wrong. There were no details, no suggestions, no attempt at compromise, just remove it. 10 days or pay. I walked outside and looked at the library like it had turned into something dangerous overnight. It sat there quietly, painted blue, full of stories and sticky fingerprints from curious kids. A woman across the street waved and called out that her granddaughter loved it. The contrast between that warmth and the icy language in my hand made my chest tighten. I decided it had to be a misunderstanding. That same afternoon, I emailed the HOA, attaching photos of the library and asking if there was a way to get it approved. I offered to move it closer to the house, to change the color, to add a small plaque if they wanted it to look more official. Hours went by, no response. The next morning, I got a reply. It was one line long. Per community guidelines, no freestanding structures are allowed in front yards without prior written approval. No greeting, no name, no acknowledgement of what the structure actually was. I pulled up the HOA documents I'd received when I moved in. Pages and pages of regulations about paint colors, fence height, lawn care, mailbox replacement. I searched for anything about little free libraries or decorative structures or anything similar. There was nothing specific, just vague language about maintaining visual conformity and avoiding unsanctioned installations. It was the kind of wording that could mean almost anything, depending on who was reading it. And in our neighborhood, the ones reading it held all the power. I tried again. I wrote a longer email explaining what a little free library was, including links to the national organization's website, photos of similar ones in other towns, even a note about how they'd been featured in feel-good news stories all over the country. I said I was happy to submit a formal application, to attend a meeting, to do whatever prior written approval required. This time the reply was slightly longer. Your structure was installed without prior approval, therefore it is in violation. You are required to remove it. You may reapply for a compliant alternative at a later date. A compliant alternative, as if a box of books needed to be redesigned to fit some invisible standard. Days passed, each one tighter than the last. Kids still came to the library. Some parents walked up and thanked me quietly, their voices low, like they were afraid someone would overhear. One person slipped a thank you card into the library, tucked between two paperbacks. But the HOA's attention had been drawn, and once they fixate on something, they don't look away. The first notice of violation appeared taped to my front door a week later. Bright orange, impossible to miss. It stated that I was now officially out of compliance and that fines would begin in 3 days if the library wasn't removed. The language was more aggressive this time. It referenced enforcement procedures. It mentioned possible legal action. It warned that continued non-compliance could result in a lien on my property. I stood on my porch, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, and felt something shift inside me. Fear, yes, but also a slow-burning anger. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about visual conformity. This was about control, about the idea that anything not pre-approved and blandly identical was a threat. I tried to talk to Marlene in person. She was in her front yard, measuring the distance between her hedges and the sidewalk like she was preparing for a home inspection from God himself. I walked over, holding the notice, and asked if we could talk about the library. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She said it was nothing personal, that she was just doing her job, and that the board had unanimously agreed the library had to go. When I asked why, specifically, she said, "If we let you do this, where does it end? Someone else might want a birdhouse. Someone else might want a statue. Then someone wants a bench. Before you know it, the neighborhood looks messy." Messy. That was the word she chose for a box of books. I asked if there had been any complaints. She shifted her weight and said some residents had expressed concern. When I asked who, she wouldn't say. "We don't name names," she replied, "but I can assure you it's not just me." That phrase, "it's not just me," was meant to make it sound reasonable, like there was a silent majority behind her. But I had a hard time believing that when so many people had already told me they loved the library. The deadline came. I didn't remove it. The fines started. At first, it was a notice in the mail, $50, then another, $100. The letters started to stack up, each one a little harsher than the last. My email inbox filled with warnings and reminders of your obligations as a homeowner. The tone became scolding, like I was a child who needed correcting. I began to feel it in my body, tight shoulders, pounding headaches, a constant low-level anxiety humming under every normal task. It stopped being just about the library and started being about something bigger, whether I was allowed to make my own home feel like my own. The HOA didn't stop with the fines. They started documenting. One morning, I looked out the window and saw a man I didn't recognize standing on the sidewalk, taking photos of the library with his phone. He circled it like it was a crime scene, zooming in on the posts, the sign, the books inside. He took photos of my house too, my yard, even my front porch. When I stepped outside and asked if I could help him, he said he was performing an inspection per the board's request and walked away without another word. Soon after that, the whispering started. At the bus stop, I overheard two parents talking about the guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. A neighbor across the street stopped waving when we passed. Another, who had once asked for my chili recipe, started avoiding eye contact altogether. It wasn't everyone. Some people were openly supportive. A retired teacher down the lane told me she thought the HOA was bored and power-hungry. A single dad around the corner started dropping off extra books he found at thrift stores. A young couple told me they'd started reading together again because they grabbed a novel from the library on a whim. But those people spoke softly, like they were sharing a secret. The board spoke loudly, in letters and fines and threats. The tipping point came when I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. It was thick, printed on heavy letterhead, and full of phrases that made my throat tighten. Continued non-compliance, immediate action required, potential lien, legal fees to be borne by the homeowner. They enclosed copies of the fines issued so far and a projected total if I continued to ignore directives. The total, if it went on as threatened, was more than my mortgage payment. That night, after my daughter went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by stacks of paper, the original violation, the follow-up notices, the attorney letter, printouts of the HOA rules covered in my highlighter marks. I thought about taking the library down. I thought about the relief of quiet. I thought about not having to feel that gut drop every time I saw the HOA logo. But then I thought about the kids, the note in the book, my daughter watching that first boy walk away with a story in his hands. If I let them win over something this small and this good, what else would they decide they had the right to control? So instead of tearing it down, I did something the HOA wasn't expecting. I went public. I started small. I wrote a post in a local community Facebook group explaining what was happening. I kept it factual, attached photos of the library and screenshots of the violation letters, and asked a simple question. Should a little free library really be against the rules? I hit post, fully expecting it to get a handful of comments and disappear into the noise. It didn't. Within hours, the post had hundreds of reactions and dozens of comments. People from my own neighborhood, nearby subdivisions, and even other parts of town weighed in. Most were furious on my behalf. Some shared their own HOA horror stories. A few said things like, "This is exactly why I'll never live in an HOA community." Someone tagged a local journalist who covered human interest stories. Someone else tagged the official Little Free Library organization. People asked for the HOA's exact wording. A few offered to help with legal advice. By the next morning, the post had been shared so many times it felt like the whole town knew. That was when I realized something. I was no longer just a homeowner with a problem. I had become a symbol of something people were already angry about: abuse of petty power, overreach, the way small positions attract big egos. The HOA did not appreciate the attention. The board sent out a community-wide communication that afternoon. It landed in everyone's inbox with the subject line, clarifying recent misinformation. They didn't use my name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. They said a resident had mischaracterized the board's enforcement actions and that their goal was simply to maintain safety and uniformity. They claimed the library could attract loitering, was an unapproved structure, and could set a dangerous precedent. They framed themselves as the reasonable adults in the room, forced to take action because one homeowner refused to follow the same rules as everyone else. Some people believed them, others didn't. And some, who until then had stayed neutral, didn't like the way the board tried to shut down the conversation. More messages started appearing in my inbox. A mother whose son used the library said she was willing to speak up publicly. A retired man who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years said he'd never seen the board act this aggressively over something so harmless. A teacher from the local elementary school reached out and said she wanted to support any effort that got more books into kids' hands. But with the growing support came a darker side. One night, just before midnight, I heard a noise outside, footsteps on gravel, a quick shuffle. By the time I made it to the window, whoever it was had gone. The next morning, I found the library's door hanging open, a few books scattered on the grass, one of them soaked from the sprinklers. A handwritten note had been taped to the side. "Rules are rules. Take this thing down." There was no name, no signature, just shaky handwriting and the echo of something meaner behind the words. I cleaned up the books, dried what I could, and tightened the screws on the door. My hands shook more than I wanted my daughter to see. She watched me through the window, her face pale, and I realized this wasn't just affecting me anymore. It was bleeding into her sense of safety, too. The HOA's next move made that even clearer. They announced a special meeting of the board to discuss ongoing compliance issues. The notice made it sound routine, procedural, boring. But through the neighborhood grapevine, I heard what it really was: a public showdown. They were planning to make an example out of me. The meeting would be open to all residents. The little free library would be on the agenda. The board would present their case. They expected me to show up alone, outnumbered, and quietly back down. Instead, I decided I wasn't going alone at all. Word spread faster than the board realized. Neighbors passed it along in hushed conversations. People messaged me asking for the date and time. The local journalist who'd been tagged in my post reached out again, more interested now that the board was escalating things. Someone hinted that a member of the town council had seen the online debate and was curious. The HOA thought they were tightening the screws. They hadn't yet realized that in trying to crush a tiny library, they were about to invite in something they couldn't control: the rest of the town. And as the night of the meeting approached, one question hung in the air like a storm cloud. When the board finally tried to shut me down in front of everyone, who would the neighborhood choose to stand behind? The people with the rules, or the man with the books? The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot looked like it did on 4th of July. Packed, overflowing, cars jammed along the curb all the way down the street. I pulled in with my daughter in the back seat and just sat there for a second, staring at the crowd through the windshield. I had expected a dozen people, maybe 20. There were at least 60. The clubhouse lights glowed against a low, heavy sky. Clusters of neighbors lingered by the entrance, talking in low, tense voices. Some held printed copies of my Facebook post. One woman had a tote bag full of books. I saw the retired teacher, the young couple, the single dad. People I barely knew, but who had apparently decided this wasn't just my fight anymore. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The HOA board sat at a long folding table at the front of the room facing rows of metal chairs. They all had matching binders stacked neatly in front of them. Marlene sat squarely in the center, wearing a blazer so stiff it looked like armor. Her expression was neutral, but the tightness around her mouth gave her away. On an easel beside the board's table, someone had placed blown-up photos of my front yard. One zoomed in on the little free library. Another showed a wide shot of my house, the box of books front and center. It felt surreal to see my lawn turned into a prop in their performance. A murmur rippled through the crowd as I walked in. Some people gave me small nods. Others whispered, "That's him." My daughter's hand slipped into mine, her fingers tense. I told her she could sit in the back if she wanted, but she shook her head and stayed close. The meeting started with the usual formalities: approval of previous minutes, a quick financial update. People shifted in their seats, clearly waiting for the main event. Even the board rushed through it, anxious to get to the part they thought they were in control of. Finally, Marlene cleared her throat and announced, "Next on the agenda, ongoing compliance issues regarding an unauthorized front yard structure." She didn't say little free library, just unauthorized structure. as if she were talking about a shed or a fence or some illegal addition. She gestured to the enlarged photos on the easel. "As most of you are aware," she began, "a resident installed an unapproved structure in their front yard without prior written consent from the board. Despite multiple notices and opportunities to comply, this structure remains in place. The board is obligated to enforce our covenants fairly and consistently. This is not about personal preference. This is about maintaining property values and safety standards for everyone." Her voice was smooth, but underneath it, there was a strain. She was trying to project authority while knowing there were more eyes on her than she was used to. She clicked a small remote and the projector behind her lit up. On the screen, a slide titled "Policy Enforcement, Unauthorized Structures." Bullet points listed liability concerns, visual uniformity, and precedent. It was like watching someone give a corporate presentation about crime statistics, except the crime was a blue box of books. She finished by listing the fines I'd accrued, the letters sent, the deadlines missed. She said, "At this point, we are prepared to pursue legal remedies, including but not limited to a lien on the property unless the homeowner complies immediately." There it was, the threat spoken aloud in front of everyone,